Yeah, super happy you could join me. And I thought a cool place to start would be with something I've been thinking a lot about, which is just like the paradox of teaching and learning improvisation with the drums, where like we're all supposed to learn all these rudiments, but then if we play too many chops at a gig or on Instagram, like everybody hates it. So there's this running thread of like just groove, bro, no chops. But then secretly everybody kind of wants to chop, and it just seems like there's not, at least historically, there hasn't been a ton of good instruction around it. And I remember a few years ago, I think one of your first videos I saw was one around like building a solo. So I'm just curious how you approach improvising on the drums, and also like what you would say to a student or like an intermediate drummer about how to prioritize improvising versus things like groove.
Well, first of all, I should probably start out by saying, like, I may have been heard once or twice kind of slamming the whole chops thing because, Instagram kind of ruined it for a lot of people, me included. But I mean, I still, at the end of the day, think it's super important to develop your chops for sure, because we all need as large a vocabulary as possible. And, the best way, it's probably even kind of corny at this point, but it's just true. If you parallel that whole thing to, just the English language, because a lot of drummers, especially new drummers, they like to, they're always asking like, how do you make stuff up? Which is a common question with new drummers. And I just kind of say, listen, think of something that you know a lot about. Like say it's, I don't know, fishing. If I ask you about fishing, you wouldn't have any problem talking about it. And improvising is the same thing. Like if you have a large enough vocabulary, you can solo for 20 minutes without, skipping or dropping a beat or whatever. So learning the chops is important because it gives you what I like to call headroom, and just makes all the easier stuff even easier. So you just end up sounding like a cleaner drummer when you got all those chops behind you, because it cleans up everything behind you. Because there's so much you can't. There's a lot of things involved in learning chops that you can't get away with if you're sloppy. So you're forced to learn all of these little micro movements and stuff like that. And it's the micro movements that makes everything else sound super smooth and clean, and it makes it look super easy when you're playing and stuff like that. But as far as an improvisational standpoint, there's so many different approaches that you see on YouTube. It can be confusing for a new drummer to decide where to start, because you hear drummers talking about, well, you start with a motif, and you build on that. Or, you start out with some kind of ostinato kind of thing and do that. Or you can do the 4-bar phrase or the 8-bar phrase thing and do that kind of thing. And that can be a little confusing. Like if you don't have any experience doing any of that stuff, it can be a little bit, it's hard to know where to start when you're, trying to choose which one of those to go. So I always try to break it down, and I just say, just learn the alphabet first. Get super comfortable with every single one of the subdivisions, because that's your foundation. Your subdivision, again, is going to sound corny, but it's like your alphabet. And that kind of, as far as like different styles of music and all of that, it's more or less the same alphabet. It's just applied different ways, right? So a triplet in North America is different than a triplet in Africa, right? The accent's different, but it's still a triplet. So, the foundation is exactly the same. Everybody's playing the same subdivisions. They're just throwing accents in different spots and stuff like that. So once you're comfortable with the alphabet, then you can start, like, if you really want to start practicing improvisation from the ground floor up, after you learn your alphabet, then you just kind of practice going in and out between all of them. Doesn't even really need to sound good at that point. What you're trying to do is sort of develop your ability to put phrases together. That's how that whole idea starts. And I don't know about you, but the way I learned how to solo was just copying like everybody. So, after you've gotten comfortable with all your subdivisions, now I'm sort of listening to other drummers to find out how they say this or how they use this and how they do that type of thing. And then, when you're new to all of that stuff, but you got a couple of years of that under your belt of having learned the alphabet and checking out different drummers and stuff. A lot of times when you solo, you're going to be quoting different drummers. And that's something I used to do like all the time. Like I was a big, huge Dave Weckl fan. Like when his contemporary drummer package came out back in the 90s, like I had that and I wore that VHS out like crazy. So when I was improvising stuff back then, it was more about, phrase retention. Like it's just trying to play everything that I heard him do or Dennis Chambers do or whatever. You just kind of throw stuff together and see if it works. You're still not entirely kind of talking off the cuff. You're more quoting other drummers, but it's that sort of arena of quoting other drummers where later on you develop your own thing, and that's how you end up, improvising. When it comes to improvising in the moment, then with experience, you start to learn how to, like if you're playing with music, in other words, like if you're soloing over a comp or something, you eventually just learn how to react. You refer back to your vocabulary and you start throwing some cool stuff together. And you're more or less kind of interacting with what's happening musically. When you're making stuff up, again, you go back to copying other drummers. It's easier. It's easier to organize if you chop it up into 4-bar phrases, 8-bar phrases, like Carlock does. But there's a lot to it, man. Like there's the whole idea of improvisation is a huge topic, and it's hard to just kind of, answer in a couple of minutes.
Of course. But that's what makes it a fun challenge. And we can weigh in with a hot take here or there, but I think the internets will forgive us if we don't solve improvisation in 45 minutes.
One thing I just wanted to add to it though is all of the chopping out that you see, on Instagram and stuff. I might get slammed for saying this, but I don't consider that improvisation. Because if you break it down to, if you strip away everything that drummer's doing, it's just a big string of 16ths or 30 seconds. There's not a whole lot musically going on there. So, when you listen to somebody like Steve Smith, it's a whole different thing than just listening to, some Chopzilla dude just spewing out 30-second notes for 5 minutes. Like it's a different thing. So I don't want young people to think that stuff is improvisation so much, because it's really not. To me, anyway, there's a huge musical element that's missing from all that, and that's why a lot of drummers get bored of it. After a few bars.
The paradox kind of comes back there too, where it's a little like saying, or it's a little like taking a young driver who's interested in auto racing, but doesn't want to do donuts or stunt driving or something like that. I don't know if you're into auto racing at all, but saying like, here, watch Michael Schumacher take like a perfect apex and notice how he's not showing off at all. And then he's like, well, here's another video of him like doing donuts. And it can be similar where What I feel like I'm missing sometimes with my students is avatars of drummers who play really clean, concise ideas that seem accessible to other drummers. I think one great example is Brian Blade. Another great example might be someone like Ash Sohn. I'm sure there are others, but the problem is, and even I do this, when we start to get some jobs under our hands, we want a job. So you can take somebody, I won't name any names, but I'm sure there are plenty of drummers who, if the situation called for it, would be very reserved with what they played and musical. But when you point an iPhone at them during a sound check and say, "This is going on the gram," of course they're going to want to get their chops out. And I think it's confusing because as a young player, you're probably thinking there are two extremes. Either there are these Instagram hot doggers, or there's the sort of stop the chop minimalism, and there's no middle ground. So I do struggle to find like good examples of clean musical playing that benefits from facility with the language of improvising around the drums without taking it too far.
I'm the same. Like, I don't know of many drummers that does that kind of stuff successfully. There's a small sort of crop of drummers that I really like to watch, that are really doing some like ridiculous stuff that just gives you like just enough of everything. Mm-hmm. Justin Tyson's one of them. Tyson's a beast. Like all the stuff that he's doing with Glasper is nuts. He's a lot of fun to watch. I'm still into like I like Carlock a lot too. I'm a big fan, but I'm so, because of my age, I don't know if I'm going to age myself here, but I'm still like, for the most part, I'm still a big fan of like all my 90s guys. I'm that era. I'm the Weckel, the Gad, the Koliuta. That I'm still, because to this day I'm watching those older solos and I'm still going like, what is going on here? As much as I sort of know now, I'm still looking back, trying to figure out, what it is that they're doing. It's more about, it's a lot less about being impressed with how fast they're playing, or even what they're playing for that matter. I'm more into like, how did you think of doing that there? It's crazy. Will Kennedy's another one. I love Will Kennedy and the Yellow Jackets. Any one of his solos. Like I remember we went to see them. They came up to St. Catharines last summer. My wife and I went to see him, and Will did this solo, and I almost fell out of my chair laughing because it was that good. Like how is he thinking of all of this stuff? And I think that's sort of like, that should be everyone's goal, really. Like to be that proficient on the drums and that good at improvisation that it doesn't so much make people, freak out because of the fireworks, but it's more about just like the ability to make people listen to every single thing that you're saying instead of just reacting because of this monstrous lick you just played.
Yeah, I think Steve Gadd's another good one. That's one that hadn't occurred to me. And I agree. I think Vinny in any sort of musical situation, like obviously Sting, 10 Summoner's Tales, like maybe one or two hot licks on that entire album. Like at the end of 7 days, like he gets his chops out just a little bit, but then the rest of it is just like laying down groove. Steve's a very good one. Like Steve on Asia, right? Steve with Steely Dan, in terms of the cleanliness, the minimalism, but also the musicality as a great avatar for how a great player approaches a real life musical situation and the proportion of chops and groove and the musical choices. I think another issue is that as drummers, we're confining ourselves to the sort of group of drummers. So we're not necessarily including like Ringo or Charlie Watts, or Mitch Mitchell or some of these other players who are great and who I appreciate. And maybe this is wrong of me, but I sort of relegate them to more of the like band drummers or multi-instrumentalist drummers rather than like technicians necessarily. But I think that's wrong. I think I should be more open-minded to appreciate those guys. And maybe people like Patrick Carney, who plays with the Black Keys these days. I had another question, sticking with this theme of improvisation and psychology for a minute, which is that another paradox I find is the need to be very conscious about our choices in the practice room, but then try to shut off our left brain almost entirely in performance. And I found when I was first starting to take what I was doing in the practice room and try to apply it on gigs or in performance situations, that wasn't intuitive. That, okay, now I'm supposed to shut my left brain off and just feel my way through things. Did you find it was easy for you to get into those sort of flow states and just feel when you were performing, or did it take some effort?
That took a lot of effort, because like, if I understand what you're talking about, it's like there's a bunch of stuff that you practice in the practice room to sort of prep yourself for the experience on stage. But when you get on stage, none of that stuff that you practice seems to want to come out. At least that's what it is for me.
True. And also maybe the idea that we shouldn't be consciously thinking about, I'm going to play this, like I'm going to play that. We should be listening and reacting and feeling.
Yeah, exactly. That was sort of my point. So, when you're in the moment, you're not in the mindset of remembering licks that you practice, because you're trying to stay present to what's going on, but you still want to make a good presentation. So I think that's why a lot of us end up disappointed after our solos. We think we did such a horrible job because we didn't play this and we didn't play this or whatever. I sort of like to think of it like, when I get in those situations, and for instance, I just played Victoria Drum Fest a couple of weeks ago, and I opened the event. I was the first one on, and I opened with a solo.
I saw that. That was a great solo. I like it.
Thanks. You can see it on YouTube. But when I got off the stage, part of me was kind of, I don't want to use the word disappointed, but it was more like, I was doubting myself a lot, because it wasn't full of a whole bunch of monstrous chops or anything like that. And it's a drum festival. So it's like I felt like I had to do more. But the feedback was so good that it was just sort of confirmation for me of something that I used to tell myself all the time and still try to. And it's just like, in those situations, if you didn't say it at the time, then it probably didn't need to be said. So if I spent more time, trying to go through my Rolodex of licks and making sure I got all of them out, it would have turned into a different solo. But the tension that was there during that solo, and the only reason the tension was there is because I was so nervous when I went up there, like opening the show, that kind of brought a different type of energy, I think, to the solo. And it just kept me a little more focused on what I was doing and less concerned about whatever it was that I was practicing before I got there. So yeah, that's a whole thing, man, because there's a lot of stuff that you want to practice when you're working on your soloing. But I can tell you right now, man, when you get in a situation where it's time to do it, you're probably going to forget almost all of it, and you just sort of have to just read the room and be present, and then just play music. So this is where the vocabulary becomes important, because if your vocabulary is limited, you know, you're going to revert to running on your double kick until people start screaming.
Yeah.
And that's not really a solo. So
Yeah. Come to think of it, this is another really interesting topic that I've been thinking about, and I've had students and people in the YouTube comments ask me about a bunch too, which is like performance anxiety and worrying we're going to measure up when we perform. And one thing I think about is, I think the number of times people in the audience finish listening to a drum solo and say, I wish he'd played more 30 seconds, are probably close to zero. I think the number of times people have said that just seemed like undifferentiated single strokes for 10 minutes, probably non-zero. So yeah, one thing I try to put in my head when I perform is like, just don't be boring. So it's like, we spend a lot of our time in the practice room trying to get clean, and as you say, like trying to workshop these ideas, but it's almost like we have to forget that and be willing to just dive off the cliff. And if something doesn't work, who cares, right? Like if we drop a stick, if we hit a rim, like no one in the audience is going to be like, oh, he dropped a stick. But if the solo is boring, or if it seems self-conscious, they will pick up on that, right?
yeah, that's a really good point. It's because people, just like you said, they'll pick up on the opposite. Like people will know and will clearly see if you're purely going for audience response and not concerned about playing any kind of music. Mm-hmm. You're just trying to get people to yell back at you and, hype up the room or whatever. But when you do the opposite and, you just sort of ground yourself in the moment and then just play stuff, people will remember that more. I think they'll have a much more positive reaction to doing that than just for going for the cheap screen. So yeah, but I just don't know. I'm not 100% sure how I would tell someone to get to that point. That's a hard thing to teach.
It's like saying, don't think of an elephant, isn't it? Don't be nervous when you play. Whatever you do, don't think about an elephant. Yeah, you kind of have to sneak up on it, don't you?
Exactly. Yeah, well put.
I'm curious about another thing, which is, as somebody who's played both in the analog world and played a ton and continues to play gigs, but also obviously has a foothold in new media and YouTube and Instagram. How important do you think it is for, this is almost going to sound silly, but how important do you think it is for drummers to have real world experience playing with real musicians? And what do you think that gives somebody that they can't get from just practicing or playing along with tracks?
Wow. I mean, at the end of the day, that's really the most important thing. Like, why, if you're going to spend half your life perfecting the art of public speaking and you never talk in front of people, then what's the point? Right? We become musicians. Like, a big part of being a musician is the communication aspect. So if you're not eventually playing with people, then what are you doing it for? If all you're doing is practicing for Instagram, that's one thing. I'm sure there's people out there doing that, but the experience of playing with other people is really what's going to sharpen your skills up, for sure. Because it's one thing to react to a loop or a backing track for 5 minutes. It's another thing to be soloing over a vamp played by real musicians in front of an audience. That's an entirely different thing. You're going to get way more out of the latter than the former. The former will almost kind of prepare you for it, but the experience of interacting with other musicians is what's going to make you an effective musician, because you can play to all the tracks you want, When the time comes to jump into a studio situation, you're going to have to know more than what you've been practicing for the last 2 years. You haven't developed any sort of real world skills to sort of react, or even more important, produce yourself. Because, in a lot of studio situations, you're not always just sort of the hired trained monkey. Like they're going to ask you for input, which means you're going to need ideas, which means you're going to need a vocabulary. And if you don't have one, if you played something that you loved, but they didn't think it was good for the take, it's like, can you I kind of dug that, but, can you do a little something similar but different? Now you got to interpret whatever the frig that meant and go back in there and come up with something else. And if you never play with people, you're never going to develop that skill ever. Man, that's the most important part of being a musician is playing with other musicians, for sure. Not just that, but playing with other musicians that are better than you is even more important. If you can get into that situation, if they're patient enough that you can sit and learn with them, man, you're going to get way, way more out of that. So, yeah, that is super important, man.
On that note, do you have any experiences from gigs or bands or band leaders when you were learning where you learned a very specific lesson from a gig situation? Is there anything that stuck with you where it was like there was a definitive before and after due to some sort of lesson you learned as a result of playing with people?
Yeah, there's quite a bit. And there were different things that I learned. Like every situation brings something, and the reward is always cool afterwards too. But I've been in some situations where the nature of the gig forced me to step my game up before. Those situations are cool too, where you're kind of like for instance, I was doing this theater production once in Toronto, and there was a big sort of like ballet troupe that was playing with us, and we were sort of like the live music that they would perform to. One of the songs was a super fast swing, like north of 190. I think it was like close to 200. And at the time, my swing sucked, and I had about 2.5 weeks to prepare for this. So it was just like, hold my calls, don't bug me, send my dinner down in a plastic bag because I'm not coming up. And it just forced you to develop that skill to the point where you could at least get through the gig, which I did successfully, and it was cool. But the takeaway from that is, of course, the ability to now be able to swing at higher tempos. And even if you never do that again for the rest of your life, the mechanics involved with doing that, there's going to be a lot of benefits that's going to spill back down to all of the easier stuff that you need to do. So that's one thing. Another situation, for a couple of years, I've played with my brother Rich's band, Rinse the Algorithm, which is this like a crazy sort of improvisational, jazz kind of thing. I'm sure you've heard of them. I was in that band for a couple of years, and the whole idea that I was saying before about playing with people that are better than you and the benefits that come out of that was a cool experience for me because, I was in situations where I had to really sort of get my soloing up. Being able to play solos confidently with those guys in front of an audience did a whole lot for me too. And yeah, there's been a few situations too, and then there's other ones where Another one that I'll bring up is just playing in church. Playing in church is an entirely different thing than doing secular gigs because the approach is different. In secular gigs, you practice a song one way, you get up on stage and you play it that way. But when you're in church, when you're playing worship music and stuff like that, it could go in any direction. So I think one of the reasons why, like, especially back in the 90s, a lot of R&B acts were hiring church musicians is because the discipline is way different in church. And that stuff carries over to, the secular world. And a lot of those experiences, you're just a different breed of musician. And I think that's why they were so popular with R&B acts, because the arrangements themselves were friggin' bananas. Like nobody out there was doing that, before the church boys showed up. So yeah, like everything just sort of, there's benefits to every situation.
Another thing I'm curious about is, I'm sure that as a result of being on YouTube, you get a lot of comments about your stuff. And if you're anything like me, you probably learn things about what the audience takes for granted and doesn't take for granted that are surprising to you. Like just for instance, I don't know, the idea that being able to keep the one in your head, and being able to come in and cut out exactly with the band is like important, is something that a lot of people in my comments like hadn't realized. Maybe most of them had, but I got enough comments of that sort that I was like, that's interesting. That's a thing. So I'm curious if there are any analogous things where weird comments you've gotten or just comments you've gotten or correspondence you've had with your audience since you've had an internet presence has surprised you about the sort of either level of knowledge or assumptions that the audience has, and if there are certain things you take for granted that it was surprising to you that you had a different understanding of than your audience.
I don't know. I think maybe, offhand, maybe my approach to time playing seems to be a popular thing. This is my favorite thing to talk about, is playing time. Like if I'm doing a clinic or something, that's probably my favorite topic to teach, because the approach to developing that skill is a lot easier than people think. And it's got nothing to do with sleeping with a friggin' metronome under your pillow, which is ridiculous. All that's going to do is keep you up. But the approach to developing really good time is pretty basic. And, when I start talking about the whole idea of just starting with the subdivision and, grounding yourself in the quarter note, and the whole, like, your quarters are sort of the stakes in the ground, and then all the other subdivisions are kind of played around it. When people start to get that, then, everything kind of opens up for them. And the idea of learning how to play solid time just gets easier, because it all just starts to make sense. And it's really, it really is that simple. Like if you start with the subdivision, and how to play all of them around this, then that's the secret, really, to playing good time. Like the reason why tight bands sound tight is because everybody on stage is subdividing at exactly the same rate. They know when to stab the end of 3 because everybody's subdividing at exactly the same rate. And I'm talking like pre-click on stage. Like that used to be a natural ability. When you're watching Earth, Wind, and Fire or something, there's 95 people on the stage and everybody's stabbing one particular beat. That's a skill that, I don't want to, if I call it a lost skill, I'll sound like the old guy, but it kind of is. It's kind of the lost skill. There's too much help these days because, you got to click in one ear. You got, the Pro Tools or Ableton Live or whatever tracks you got in the other ear. And there's a lot of support there. to sort of help you out. But before, you didn't have that. You had to develop that ability. And it used to be just commonplace that good musicians were just able to do that. And the approach to learning it, like I said, is really simple. Like it's really just all about the subdivision. It's got nothing to do with how well you can play with a click. If you can subdivide the quarter note at whatever tempo it is, then you're playing good time.
One thing I've gotten in my comments a bunch that's of the species of the type of thing I was talking about is people assuming that you can't teach or learn to play time. Like I'll get a bunch of you just need to feel it. I'll get a bunch of you're either born with it or you're not. I think you just need to feel it is partially true. I think a good place to start is probably like if you've never practiced time, like turning on a Steve Jordan track and just feeling the beat is probably a good way to start. But there are, I'll segue this into a question, but in my opinion, for some of us, and I think maybe for me, because I didn't grow up playing with strong musicians. Like I grew up playing with records, and then I was in band, and then gradually I was in garage bands with other people who were just learning. So I didn't necessarily have a church background, or what wasn't blessed like some of our heroes to have like world-class musicians around the house I could just play with. So I think because of that, like my perceptions in the moment were faulty sometimes. Like I would feel like something was steady when actually if I listened back it was speeding up or slowing down. So I needed practice to correct those things. But yeah, super logical question on the back of that is you developed a simple, easy to teach method for time playing. Did time playing come reasonably naturally for you, or do you feel like you needed to work hard to develop it?
I don't think I'll contradict myself saying this, but yes, I had a fairly decent ability to keep time from the beginning. So I think there's a certain group of musicians where it's just easy, for not just drummers, but everything, guitar players, violinists, it doesn't make any difference what it is. Some people are just naturally born with good natural timekeeping ability. Whereas others, yes, I think it can be taught. For some people, it might take them a little longer. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, there are other people that just, no matter how much you teach them, they just don't have it. They just naturally have really crappy time. And, there's no real explanation for it. But I think for a lot of musicians that start out with weak timing, with the right instruction, they can totally, as long as they're pointed in the right direction and they're given specific ways on how to do it, other than just like sitting on the kit and playing to a click. It's a good start, but it doesn't stop there. Like there's other things that you're going to need to do to internalize it. When you're just playing with a click, you're sort of trying to develop good time on the surface, where it needs to come from sort of the inside out.
Yeah.
So that's why with a lot of drummers, they play great with a click, and you take it away, and their time completely sucks. So starting with the subdivision and that whole idea, that fixes everything. That gives you good time playing on your own, and it gives you good time when you don't have any reference there to follow. And you just sort of develop this ability to, if someone says, "Oh, this tune's going to be around, 87 beats per minute," you can just you can launch into it, and you'll get within a couple of BPM in that ballpark pretty easily, and you'll be able to sustain it too, which is, sort of the whole point. But another thing that I'm kind of want to throw this back to you, because I think this is So another interesting kind of question on the same vein is, you know, is it learnable and is it teachable? But I've asked the same question about feel. Is it possible, like if your feel sucks, is that something that you can learn? And I got some pretty interesting sort of responses from both ends. So a lot of people think that you can. A lot of people think that you can't. It's like you have the crowd that says if you don't have it, you won't have it. And then there's others that say, well, you know, with enough work, you can sort of develop it. So I'll ask you, like, do you think feel is something that you can develop, or is it one of those things that you either have it or you don't?
That's an interesting one. Yeah, it's something we've both thought a lot about, isn't it? I would say off the top of my head that I think you're right, that there are probably some people who just aren't predisposed to have good time or good feel. I wonder if the selected crop of people who approach us or one of us for lessons probably are already a little bit curated insofar as if they've thought about it for that long, they've probably got some years playing under the belt. Probably they have some kind of innate ability, but they're just hitting some blockers. Yeah. And I would even wonder, I'm thinking about the hypothetical person who just loves Steve Jordan and Steve Gadd, and every time they sit down to play, they love the feeling of the subdivision of the music and how it makes them dance. And then when they play a beat unaccompanied by music or a metronome, it's got some distortions in it. My assumption would be it would be pretty difficult for that person to have such a deep love of groove and feel without probably being able to grasp it if you just give them some handholds for, as you say, how to think about subdivision or how to train their instincts a little bit better. I'm sure that for some people it's a longer road. But yeah, I'm wondering how that resonates with you.
I don't know, man. I think it's feel, because feel and time they start in two different places. Like time is more of a technical thing, mm-hmm. where feel is more of a personality thing. So you can write, for instance, like you can write down a joke and give it to two people. Give one to Jerry Seinfeld, give Jerry Seinfeld one and Dave Chappelle the same joke. Mm-hmm. Those two jokes are going to be delivered two completely different ways. One might be funnier than the other. They both might be funny, but for different reasons. But in either way, you can't teach it. You can't go to school to learn how to tell a joke like Jerry Seinfeld. Mm-hmm. If you have to go to school for comedy, you're just not funny. Like, pick up something else.
Right.
Feel, I think, is the same way. Like, personality has a lot to do with feel, I think. Mm-hmm. And, a really good example. I think one drummer that a lot of people kind of underestimate in a lot of ways is Questlove. People don't understand how hard it is to do what Questlove does.
Yeah.
When you hear some of the grooves that he's playing with D'Angelo, like Sugar Daddy or something, and you hear, the level of consistency going on, the bounce that's happening there, mm-hmm. you don't realize how good that feel is until you sit down and you try to play it and sound like Questlove.
Yeah.
You're sitting there trying to figure out what is he doing? Like, why does this thing feel so good? It's just his natural feel, which I think is kind of hard to teach. And there are really experienced drummers out there that wouldn't be able to do it.
Yeah.
So there are a lot of aspects of feel, I think enough aspects of feel for me to say with a bit of confidence that no, you can't. Feel is one of those things where you got it or you don't. It's like being funny. You're either funny or you're not. And that's where I'm at. You can sort of you can practice enough sort of technique that, you know, a particular groove that you can play will feel good. But, you know, especially with the triplet, the sort of foundational triplet type of grooves, those ones, the feel really kind of gets amplified when you're playing those types of grooves. Because if you don't have it, like if your shuffle sucks, people will know whether you're a musician or not. You can hear it. Mm-hmm. And, you know, hip hop grooves and, you know, reggae grooves, anything sort of based on the triplet is really where your feel gets tested. And that's when you'll hear, you know, when a drummer really has good feel or they don't, because keeping it consistent, because you can adjust your degrees of swing, and knowing how much swing is too much, or, you know, knowing if a groove needs more swing is a skill unto itself. And then you got to be able to do it. So to dial in more swing, like 17%, there are a lot of drummers that can naturally do that, and others that just can't. And it's just that's just a feel thing for me.
Yeah, there's so many factors floating around. One is that feel can be very, very individual, in the same way as comedy can be, right? So you can imagine someone like Dave Chappelle or Seinfeld, and you can also imagine somebody like Mitch Hedberg, or who's the guy who was on that show Crashing on HBO, is like a Mormon guy. So there are ways to be funny where you're sort of really, really nerdy and self-effacing. You know, there are comedians who are like Ira Glass who are still funny, and then there are comedians like Kevin Hart who just fill a room and are like have huge personality and are really raucous, who can do that. Mm-hmm. So I think I also think like someone can have the potential for a good feel because they have within their personality the desire to make something feel good. And as I say, if you imagine like the sort of hypothetical drummer who's danced to the Steve Jordan or something like that, and or, you know, maybe they like Stuart Copeland, but they just haven't assembled the raw material so they could have some blockers. And maybe this is how time and feel interrelate, where if through some time practice and some subdivision practice you resolve some of those distortions so that you hone their instincts about when, you know, you get them to a place where they can trust that what feels good sounds good. But again, like there are probably people for whom that's impossible. It's very hard to say. Well, I did want to ask. Oh, go ahead.
No, just to sort of tie that in, like, because you mentioned before, you know, the 10 Summoners album, this thing album, and I fully agree. Like that is every bit as much Vinny's album as it is Sting's album, but there's no solos on it during that. It's just an album full of really good musical decisions. And if it wasn't him playing on it, it would have been a completely different album. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that has to do with just his feel for all of those songs, like all of those decisions that he was making, and the feel that he was playing is for me is what made it what it is. So yeah, that's a big thing.
Yeah, of course. Well, we could talk about that endlessly, but I did want to ask you about something more block and tackle when it comes to just like drummer careers in the era of new media. So as a YouTuber, as somebody who's had success on the socials with your drumming, what would you say to a young drummer who's maybe just graduating from college and wondering how they're going to make a living in this world? What would you say to them, and what do you think's changed since you started that you're able to observe?
I was thinking about that like just this morning. Whether it was just like out of the blue, or maybe I was just sort of subconsciously prepping for this. knowing that eventually you would ask me that question. Um, I think the difference now is that if you're a new drummer getting into YouTube now or getting into socials and everything else, um, it's different. It's different getting into it now than when we started. Like, I'm not sure what year you actually like started going gung ho on it, like full on. For me, it was around 2017.
Mm-hmm.
And when I got into it, like I initially got into it because I just enjoyed making videos for people and, sharing whatever it was that I knew. But when YouTube became this huge sort of business machine, people started making money and it started to become like a legit career. I think it peaked around, I can't speak for everybody, but for me, like it was between like 2019 and 2022 was where it peaked. And it was like, even the medium mid-level channels were making good money on the platform doing what they were doing. But post COVID now, the advent of TikTok, all of that stuff, shorts, Instagram stories, all of this additional content now that the people that got into it before now have to think about adding to what it is that they were doing. And for a lot of us, it can be a turnoff because I have no desire to go on TikTok. A lot of people probably tell me it's a bad business decision, but for me, it's just a cesspool of low quality content. But so I stay away from that platform. But for the others, like the short, since the advent of TikTok, shorts, stories, things like that, things on YouTube have changed, and it's gotten a little bit harder for creators that have been on it for a long time now. And a lot of people are experiencing creator burnout from years of making content. And now they sort of find themselves at the point where they're making content now to try to keep up with the algorithm, which can be tough. When you're a new drummer now, when you're just getting into it now, you probably know going in that TikTok has to be part of it. You're probably already on it, before you even decided to get on YouTube. You're probably already on TikTok and you got enough, IG stories behind your belt and all that. So you kind of know all of that stuff is coming. Whereas if you've been on it for a long time, we've had to sort of adjust and add all of that. And it's just gotten it's a little more challenging now for a few of us to sort of keep it up. But, getting into it, I guess, it's the process of getting into it now is the same as it was before. So just, you make sure that you know what you're talking about. If you're going to share information, make sure it's solid. Make sure that your communication skills are good, because that's the only thing that's going to keep your channel active, is being able to relay information so that people get it. Make sure your personality is genuine. If you got enough experience behind you, then the information that you'll be sharing will sound confident. And then people will just sort of, people will gravitate towards it that way. And then you can sort of use, like, if you want to make your central platform YouTube, now you got all these other platforms that you can use to promote your content, or, redirect people back to your audience. Or maybe you just want to, maybe you got enough hustle where you want to build enough of a following on each one of the platforms, which is cool too. But yeah, you have a lot of opportunities now, like if you're getting into it, because you can get monetized on everything now. Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, like everybody's monetizing content now. But I would first just focus on one and just be consistent and put out good, solid information. And you should be all right. I mean, the pool has gotten 10 times bigger out here, but there's still really only, a few drum channels that a lot of people are watching. Um, so, if your content is inspiring enough, then you'll be fine. Um, and I guess it depends on what you want your channel to focus on. Like if you're going to be out here doing covers all the time, that's one thing. If you want to share instruction, that's an entirely different approach. So I guess it depends. It depends on what you want to get into out there.
Yeah, I largely agree with all that. I think I agree with you that like 2019, like exactly pre-pandemic, was kind of like the high water mark. It seems like there's a disturbance in the force too. Like the algorithm clearly shifted. What I'm hoping is that it's kind of a steady state now, where like it's ambiently difficult, but it's not a bubble that's gonna pop or something that the bottom's gonna go out of.
That's what I'm hoping. Yeah.
Yeah, I asked Mike Johnston a similar question last fall around the idea of, is there enough real estate that every good drummer and good presenter has room to make a career on the socials? And he was reasonably optimistic about that. I guess the other optimistic note I would sound is that things have changed from an ecosystem where everything's gate kept, so that everything you're doing is so that you can get an opportunity to present your art to an audience. And now, for better or worse, there are no gatekeepers, and you just present your art directly to the audience, so that in a way, the focus has shifted from hustling to a different definition of hustling, which is to be really good, both as a player and a presenter, and to make work consistently, whether that's music you put up, but like the number of creators who are really doing well now, who basically wrote their own ticket, whether you want to talk about Noah and Lewis Cole, or who's the Patreon founder guy, you know who I'm talking, Jack Conte, with Pomplamoose. Or Mono Neon. I recently just saw a collab with Mono Neon, Jack Conte, and Lewis Cole on the same stage with John Schofield. So,
wow.
Yeah, I think it might be more competitive. It might be more difficult, but at least that obstacle of like, I need to impress this record exec, so that I even get an opportunity to play my art, is gone, so that now we can throw our energy toward just being really, really good at what we do and workshopping, so that within the Venn diagram of having artistic integrity, it also has interest to the audience, maybe.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the other thing to add to that too is that, if you're another important part of doing it, if you're thinking of getting into it, is making sure that you have enough different streams of I guess different streams of income, but you want to take advantage of what you can out here to sort of maximize your talents and your abilities out here. And if you want to pour all of it into YouTube, you can. I'm trying to be optimistic too, because it's such a, like, YouTube's not going anywhere, I don't think, anytime soon. So I think it was a matter of, just readjusting to what's going on here.
Yeah.
But yeah, you totally can do that. But I think a lot of us out here with channels are doing other stuff too. Like, I know for you, I think you've mentioned a couple of times that your YouTube channel, you're not worried about copyright and all that type of stuff, because you got a school. Yes.
My coaching business. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Did you have that first before you started your channel, or did it happen as a result?
Sort of as a result, but yeah, I was actually going to say that it's like, so the footprint got smaller on YouTube, but because I focused more on like high touch coaching for individual students, I was able to earn money from the channel in a different way than just, for instance, from running ads against it.
Yeah. Okay. So you were sort of able to sort of leverage your audience to get students for your main business. Yes.
Correct.
That's a really good sort of other approach to if you want to get on the platform too. Like if you got something else going on, you don't just have to use YouTube. There's a lot more to it than just the AdSense revenue. It's a really good, effective vehicle. If you've got another business going on, it's a amazing promotional tool for that. Yeah. So, when you're getting into it, you try to be specific about what your objective is, whether you want to use YouTube as sort of your main source of income, or whether you want to use it as more of a promotional tool for, whatever else you got going on. I know for a lot of us that have been here doing it for a while, like we're starting to think about the next move. Like I know I am, because I'm not expecting to retire making YouTube videos. So I'm already sort of starting to think, a little bit more about the long game and trying to figure out what my next, I know what my next couple of logical steps are going to be. But now the advantage now is I think all of my heavy lifting is done because, I have an audience now, which is probably the hardest part is sort of, developing and building your audience. All of that heavy stuff is done. So now I got a few options as far as what I want to do next. So, as a promotional tool, yeah, YouTube's just it's been awesome. It's opened up a lot of doors for me as well. So yeah, it's still a good move. If you're looking to get into it, it's still a good move. Like don't let all the talk about the algorithm changing all the time and all that. Don't let that scare you away from starting your own channel. Like if that's what you want to do, because it's still a good career move if that's what you want to do.
Hell yeah. Well, it's been fantastic catching up finally. Really, really appreciate your time. Is there anything you want to leave the audience with? Any parting shot or pearls of wisdom?
I don't know. None that I can really think of right now. I mean, you guys know where I'm at. So yeah, just keep checking out the channel and I'll inform you of any new ventures that I'm planning to take on. I think my next one is going to be announced fairly soon, like at some point in the next few months or so. So yeah, I don't know. Just keep watching and thanks for helping me get to 325K. And yeah, I just appreciate everyone that's just been a fan of the channel and ordered a piece of merch or whatever. So shout out to all of you.
Yeah, been fantastic chatting finally. Hopefully we'll do a part 2 at some point. But
yeah, man.
Yeah, glad we were able to connect.
Anytime.